Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and always thanks for watching. Well, we're going to look backward to 2014 for the big stories, but guess what? Many of the 2014 stories will be big stories in 2015. Let's get to it.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, great new year. Hope you have one. We're looking forward to a lot of big news stories in Pennsylvania. Hopefully, many of them will be good for the citizens of the state. Joining me for a roundtable or a series of a couple of reporters, actually a trio of reporters, a couple's two, I got that right. John Micek, he's the editorial page editor with the Harrisburg Patriot News and PennLive. Brad Bumsted with the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, and Mary Wilson, the Capitol reporter for Pennsylvania Public Radio. All right, I'm going to start with you, John Micek, sitting here next to me. Who would have thunk, as we say in Lancaster County, who would have thunk that Tom Wolf, last year at this time when we were chatting, it was Tom who?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Which is something the governor-elect himself said that when he was in New York for Pennsylvania Society last year, nobody knew who he was. This year he came back as the guy who'd won the whole thing. And yeah, I mean, it was really extraordinary. Even coming out of last February's endorsement meeting in Hershey, no one thought that Wolf was going to be the guy. All the majority of the votes went to Rob McCord, but they didn't endorse. Right. $10 million and one blue Jeep later, everybody in the whole state knew who he was, and galloped an early lead in the primary, won the primary, general election, and here we are.
Yeah, I mean, Brad, not only does he win the primary, he wins it by 30-plus points, and then he goes on to defeat the incumbent governor, Tom Corbett, by 10 percentage points. You've covered zillions of campaigns. How much of a surprise was this?
Oh, it was a huge surprise. We interviewed a bunch of political analysts in December of 2012 as to who they thought were going to be the people, and you know, it was Allison Schwartz, and it was Rob McCord, the state treasurer, were the two leading candidates in that. Katie McGinty was viewed as an outside chance,
now
but no one really mentioned.
Yeah.
But no one really mentioned Tom Wolf. But look, what happened was the polar vortex. Some of Wolf's people say they were aided enormously by this cold weather that kept everybody in their homes while they were running these ads.
Yeah.
And it was the most stunning political ad that people have seen in a long time. It's the best one I've certainly ever seen, which defined him, defined his family, why he would be a different kind of governor.
Right.
And all of a sudden, after that ran for weeks, it was like, this guy's pretty good. Even though you don't really know him, the ad sold him.
Yeah, Mary, he was running as a non-politician in a year in which people just were not wowed about politicians, and a brilliant introduction. I think we would all agree there. Covered lots of campaigns, not seen anything quite like it. How much of a surprise was it to you? Similar?
Yeah, it was a big surprise. I remember people predicting it very early on in the year. As soon as I think January came to a close, February came to a close, it was like, oh, he's gonna take it, because you could see it in the polls almost instantly, I think. But yeah, it was a surprise. It was a surprise by how much he won in the primary, and then really there was just very little budging of the polls all the way through November.
Yeah, that's a great point. In the polling that we did, after the 2.5 weeks or whatever it was, John Micek, the commercial ran, the Blue G introducing him. Yeah. He went from about 4 or 5 percentage points to 30 to 35 percentage points, and only increased the lead.
Yes. It's the effectiveness of good advertising, but I mean also the fact that his two nearest competitors absolutely imploded. Allison Schwartz seemingly vanished from the political landscape. Rob McCord made the conscious choice to run a series of ads and attacks, linking Mr. Wolf to some unpleasant events in New York back in the 1960s, and the former mayor Charlie Robertson down there, which backfired just terribly. For McCord, drove his negatives up. And then all of a sudden, he galloped out to even further lead. And you talk about these ads, Terry. I tell this story a lot. I remember being in Bethlehem with Wolf about a month after they went on the air, doing about a dozen interviews, and every single person I talked to a person had seen the ad at least once. Yeah. And I turned to Wolf's campaign guy. I'm like, come on, really? You're planting these people. No one has seen this many ads, but sure enough, they worked.
All right, let's run to a quick break. When we come back, we're going to start on, last year at this time, the Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, Kathleen Kane, was the rising, I hate this, but I'll say it anyway, rock star in the Democratic Party. They're talking about run for governor, talking about her maybe running for the U.S. Senate. A year later, embroiled in a series of controversies. I'll talk to the panel about that following these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Welcome back. John Micek, Brad Bumsted, and Mary Wilson, all three reporters. John now went to the dark side. He's the editorial page. I always say that. Well, I'm only kidding. Editorial page editor of the Harrisburg Patriot News and PennLive. All right, you got a free commercial on that one. All right, Brad, let's turn to Kathleen Kane. A year ago, when we were talking about it, the sky was the limit.
It was. People were talking about her for governor, for U.S. Senate. She was probably the most popular politician in the Democratic Party. She had won by more votes than Barack Obama in 2012. The sky was the limit, as you say. But what happened, I think that the real blow to her took place in mid-March of 2013 when the Philadelphia Inquirer published an absolutely explosive story that she had declined to prosecute a case that involved videotaped conversations with 5 elected officials who had taken cash payoffs, according to their story. And she said that she didn't prosecute this case because it was flawed legally. And she cited a whole bunch of different reasons why she couldn't do it.
And there were some racial implications.
There were, and that was probably the chief one. She said that there was racial targeting because all 5 of these people were black. 4 legislators and 1 former traffic court judge. But she said this couldn't be prosecuted. There was a problem with the informant and his credibility and all of that. So if we go now, flash forward to the current situation, 2 of those legislators are charged with crimes by Seth Williams, the Philadelphia district attorney, and the traffic court judge has entered a guilty plea and has a concurrent sentence to something unrelated in federal court. So, the district attorney of Philadelphia, who Kane at one point had sort of flippantly said, if you want it, you can have it, talking about this case, took it. And a number of prosecutors I've talked to agree with Seth Williams that it's a push-and-play case. You hit the button, you show the grand jury or the jury the video.
Done, He's got 1 conviction, and he's charged 1 conviction of a traffic court judge and 2 indictments. Do I have that right? 2 prosecutions pending.
That's correct. They're charged.
Charged.
Yes. And that was just the beginning of the unraveling that occurred. But in June of 2013, she issued her long-awaited Penn State report. This was on how Governor Tom Corbett, when he was Attorney General, had handled the investigation of Jerry Sandusky, the former assistant football coach at Penn State, who was eventually convicted of child molestation, 10 counts, by Corbett's successor, Linda Kelly. Complicated story, but in the end, Kane had promised to do this. It helped her get elected, but she found nothing wrong, essentially, no evidence that Corbett had dragged his feet on this investigation. It took almost 3 years. But at a press conference, things sort of imploded on Kathleen Kane, and maybe Mary would want to.
Yeah, she said there were 2 additional victims, right? And then a day later,
had to retract the statement.
Because there weren't additional victims, correct?
Right. And that day, it was such a bizarre kind of day because after the press conference, you had these 3 prosecutors who had worked on 2 prosecutors and an agent who had worked on this case, on the Sandusky case, and were like playing damage control back in the Capitol newsroom, refuting all the comments that Kane and her special deputy attorney general had just made about this case, saying that there had been no evidence that the case had taken too long to bring to a trial.
One other thing, but look at the first year she had where the lottery, the privatization of the management of the lottery and not defending the state's Defense of Marriage Act after a federal court judge ruled it unright.
Trying to close the so-called Florida loophole, which would allow people with concealed carry gun permits in Florida to bring them to Pennsylvania, trying to close a loophole there. She became she struck a controversial figure for legislators almost immediately with those decisions, saying, she was going to. Republicans would say this is an attorney general who's picking and choosing what state laws she wants to defend. But it made her popular in many ways, particularly in Democratic Party circles, right? Sure, made her even more of a Democratic darling. Right, absolutely. I want to run to a break. When we come back, I want to ask John Micek. There's another piece to this, the so-called pornographic email scandal that, we have these emails that percolated around the Attorney General's office, but went beyond that had ultimately huge implications for not just Kane, but for a whole variety of other people. I'll ask John Micek about that after the break.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania, and by the Pennsylvania Coal Alliance, representing companies involved in America's most affordable, reliable energy source. To learn more, visit pacoalalliance.com.
Welcome back. Well, we're talking about Kathleen Kane, the Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, a rising star, a series of major controversies this year. John Micek, one of them concerns this pornographic email scandal. About it, more than a dozen people have lost their jobs. I mean, first of all, what was the pornographic email scandal all about?
All right, this was a little complicated, but we'll run through this. So in the course of doing the whole Sandusky probe, Attorney General Kane and her deputies stumbled across this cache of pornographic emails that staffers within her predecessor's office had fired back and forth to each other. And saying they were gross is probably putting it mildly. And they were done on state-owned computers. So back in, September-ish, October-ish, somewhere around there?
No. In August.
I'm sorry, yeah. Kane invites a bunch of Capitol reporters over to her office to view the emails. But the only names she releases are about eight former appointees, some who were then working in the Corbett administration, all of them Republicans. Immediately takes heat for only releasing Republican names. Among them was the governor's former spokesman, Kevin Harley, the Secretary of DEP, a guy on the Board of Probations and Parole. and some others who elude me at the moment. But short form is hits the fan, and then Steve Essick of the Downtown Morning Call a couple of weeks later writes a story saying that among those who participated in this was the Supreme Court Justice Seamus McCaffrey. The difference being is that Judge McCaffrey sent his dirty emails from his home computer to people in the Attorney General's office. That eventually leads to a series of events where he gets suspended by the Supreme Court in a hugely entertaining brief penned by Ron Castile, the now retired Chief Justice. He's forced to retire. A bunch of Corbett people and state appointees get bounced.
And
then
in the AG's office get bounced. Right?
And then in the midst of this, Mrs. Kane says that she'd found what appeared to be kiddie porn in it, and that might require criminal prosecution.
But,
and then we get a walk back a day later from Renee Martin. Her spokeswoman says, well, wait a second, it wasn't that. And then a day later, we get yet another walk back where she says she might have misspoken and that it's still an open matter.
A double walk back.
Was that a double walk back?
It was. I've never seen anything quite like that. But it was, Kathleen Kane didn't do anything wrong in this whole porn scandal. She was suspected of playing politics in terms of just selectively releasing those of the Corbett administration officials prior to the election that Governor Tom Corbett was running in, okay? But she said, well, that was in response to right-to-know law requests. Well, I had the first request.
Right.
I didn't ask for those names.
Right.
I didn't ask for them at all. I asked for all the names.
Before we run to a break, I want to go to one other issue, and that is we are awaiting a Montgomery County grand jury. Go ahead.
A statewide grand jury
meeting in Montgomery County.
Yes.
With the possibility that she could be, and we're going to emphasize this, could be held in contempt. Is that correct?
That is correct, and this concerns an alleged leak by her office of grand jury material to the Philadelphia Daily News. And she testified before the grand jury in November, and at that time, came out, or actually beforehand, told us what she was going to say, and that is she acknowledges that there was a leak, but said she was unaware or did not believe that it was grand jury material. Now, she didn't say that she did it, but she was aware of it, and clearly,
All right. Now, as we tape this show for airing over the state over the weekend, we don't have a decision yet. Who knows if we could get an answer at any time. Is that correct?
Right. It could be this week. It could be next week. Or a grand jury reports can also and can be sealed, and for several weeks.
Several weeks. Okay. Yeah. Let's run to a break. When we come back, big story number 4. I'm going to start with Mary Wilson. The Pennsylvania budget. We all talked about budgets last year at this time, getting ready for Governor Corbett's last budget. Did anyone talk about a $2 billion structural deficit? I don't think so. And all of a sudden, it now emerges as the single most important fiscal problem, along with pensions, the state faces. We'll deal with that. We're going to solve that pension. No, we'll be back in a minute.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Highmark Blue Shield, changing the way health plans work for business with a variety of plan options for employers and more choices for employees. Information is available at highmark.com. Have a greater hand in your company's health. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Business Council and by the Pennsylvania Business Council Education Foundation.
Journalist Roundtable with John Micek, Brad Bumsted, and Mary Wilson. All right, Mary Wilson, let's talk a little bit about the budget. $2 billion deficit. We've all talked about this last year.
No, we weren't talking about it last year.
I'm sorry, we weren't talking about it. Right, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this is largely owed to the number of one-time fund transfers and used-up revenue sources that were baked into the budget that was just passed this past summer. Those revenues aren't going to be there when lawmakers go to draft next year's budget next June. So I think that's where a large part of this deficit comes from. You've also got eroding revenues kind of across the state's tax rolls, problems that have not a whole lot to do with politicians in particular, with what the lawmakers, with what one party is doing or the other, just kind of like big industrial economic changes.
Now, Tom Wolf wants to close the revenue gap and raise additional funds for school district funding by using, how's he want to?
By using a Marcellus Shale severance tax, by levying a tax that's not an impact fee, a per well impact fee, but by taxing gas as it comes out of the ground.
Okay.
And he's also talked during his campaign about increasing the tax, a tax on the wealthy, creating a progressive income tax. A lot of raised eyebrows as to whether he can do that without undermining the state constitution. He'll have to defend it from a constitutional challenge, in other words. But that hasn't been getting so much talk lately. Mostly it's been about the Marcellus Shale tax.
All right, John, when we get to this business here, we've got a super Republican majority. No, not quite super in the sense that they could override vetoes, but Republicans on a different page. We've got pensions. You were in New York at Pennsylvania Society when we heard from the incoming majority leader of the Senate, and he made it pretty clear.
Yeah, Jake Corman, the new majority leader from Center County, says before he'll consider any form of new revenue up to and including a severance tax, he wants pensions to be addressed. The state's contributions are going up by something like $466 million in the coming fiscal year. the unfunded liability in the two pension retirement funds is something like 45 or 65 billion, depending upon whom you talk to. There was the one plan last year that only addressed the benefit structure without addressing the debt on the back end. Republicans in the incoming Wolf administration differ on how best to address that. So you've got, confrontation
And they couldn't
pre-made.
even do pension reform when
When
Governor
there was a
Corbett
Republican
was.
administration, exactly right. Yeah.
And now you have a Democrat who has said he's not in favor of it.
And Wolf wants a severance tax. So it gets you 700 million, 600 million.
A deal?
Possibly on something.
All right, liquor privatization.
Well, yes, and that's the intended or not. You have a tag team here between incoming House Speaker Mike Turzai and Corman, where Turzai is saying before we look before we look at any new revenues at all, liquor privatization has to be done. Okay, and then Corman's saying pensions have to be done. So what's
they're
Wolf
setting
to do?
the stage.
Yeah.
Are they setting a stage for a compromise? Actually, I've always thought, by the way, that modernization, you keep the Liquor Control Board, but you do licenses, and we all can go out and buy a bottle of wine in a convenience store or in a big box store or whatever. I mean, is there a way to compromise that?
Well, I mean, yeah, sure. Some lawmakers agree with you on that, and others say the state should not be in this business at all. Get out of it. Get the $1.2 billion or whatever you'd get from selling off the whole system. You mentioned that all these things, are they setting lawmakers up for some sort of grand compromise? And that's very idealistic of you, Terry, and that's why I'm very surprised, because more often we have not a grand compromise, but a grand train wreck of issues.
I'm trying to be optimistic.
Okay, I'm sorry.
trying
It's your New Year's
to say
resolution,
as we
maybe.
go, New Year's,
Yeah.
a New Year's resolution. But I mean, I think the modernization idea, it was more popular in the state Senate, John, it seemed to me, where the House passed the privatization bill in the last session, but without a single Democratic vote. Mm-hmm. The Senate seems to be more on the modernizing side.
Yeah,
I mean,
and no one's really sort of changed their minds about it. On the other hand, when you're trying to close
but it's more
a deficit,
conservative.
and they're more conservative, and they're out of one-time fixes, and they're upending the couch cushions.
Yeah. Is Mary right? Brad Bumsted?
It's a train wreck. It's got the potential to be one.
Yeah.
But look, at some point, whether it's these issues or anything else, Governor-elect Wolf, is going to have to compromise in some way on some Republican issues, and Republicans may have to compromise on revenue to a certain extent, and there may be ways they can mask some of this, but but whether mixed privatization can work with modernization remains to be seen, because if you allow additional liquor licenses and being sold in grocery stores and 7-Elevens and all these other places, the state stores are going to be hurt by that, and gradually will go out of business.
Brad gets the last word. Thanks for coming in. Good. We'll see what's going to happen in this year, 2015. We'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.